At some point in your life, someone told you this. Maybe it was your mother or your mother-in-law or a well-meaning friend who had raised 3 children and considered themselves an authority. Maybe it was a book you read or advice you half remembered from somewhere, delivered with the confidence of something that had been true for a very long time. Pick up your baby too much and you will spoil them. Let them learn to self-soothe. If you run to them every time they cry, you are teaching them that crying works, and you will never have a moment's peace. This advice is so widely held, so consistently repeated, so embedded in the common understanding of how babies work, that most parents who follow it never think to question it. And most parents who don't follow it, the ones who pick up every cry, who hold their babies for hours, who cannot bring themselves to let them lie there and scream, carry a quiet guilt that someone, somewhere, is watching them make a mistake. Both groups deserve to know what the research actually says, because the research does not support the spoiling theory. Not partially, not with caveats, not with some nuance that allows both sides to be a little right. The data is clear, it has been replicated across decades and dozens of studies, and it points in one direction. Babies who are picked up more cry less later, not because they were given what they wanted, because their nervous system learned something that changed how it functions for years afterward. To understand why, you need to go back to something we have talked about before, the attachment system and how it operates in the infant brain. From the moment a baby is born, their nervous system is running a continuous assessment of one fundamental question. Is this world safe? Not in a conscious way, not in any way that involves thought or language or anything resembling deliberate evaluation, but at the level of the brainstem and the limbic system, the oldest, most primitive parts of the brain, the assessment is happening constantly, automatically, on the basis of one primary data source. What does my caregiver do when I signal distress? Every time a baby cries and is picked up, held, soothed, the nervous system receives an answer to that question. The signal worked. The world responded. The distress was met. Over time, across hundreds of these interactions in the first weeks and months of life, a pattern is established in the neural architecture of the developing brain. Not a belief, not a memory that can be consciously accessed. A structural feature, a calibration, a setting that determines how the stress response system operates going forward. Babies whose signals are consistently met develop a stress response system that activates appropriately and recovers quickly. The alarm fires when it needs to, and when the threat is resolved, it comes back down to baseline efficiently. Babies whose signals are consistently ignored develop a stress response system that is calibrated differently. The alarm fires more easily, more intensely, and recovers more slowly because the system has learned from repeated experience that distress is not reliably resolved from the outside, which means the nervous system has to manage it alone. And a nervous system that has to manage distress alone in an infant who has no capacity for self-regulation does not manage it well. It stays activated longer. It releases more cortisol. It builds, over time, a higher baseline level of physiological stress that becomes the new normal. This is not the baby being spoiled. This is the baby's brain building its stress architecture around the data it has been given. Now here is the part that dismantles the spoiling theory at its foundation. The spoiling theory rests on a behavioral assumption that picking up a crying baby rewards the crying and therefore increases it. It sounds logical. It is the kind of logic that applies reasonably well to training a dog or managing the behavior of a school-aged child who has developed the cognitive capacity to make strategic decisions about what actions produce what outcomes. It does not apply to a newborn. A newborn baby does not have the prefrontal cortex development required to form the kind of intentional behavioral strategy that the spoiling theory assumes. They are not crying because they have calculated that crying produces holding. They are crying because their nervous system has detected a state of distress and activated the only signal it has. There is no manipulation. There is no strategy. There is only a biological alarm that is asking, at the most primitive neurological level, for the response it was designed to receive. Responding to that alarm does not teach the baby to use it more. It teaches the baby that the alarm works. And a baby whose alarm works is a baby whose nervous system learns that distress is manageable, that the world is responsive, and that there is no need to keep the alarm running at high intensity all the time. This is exactly what the research shows. A landmark study published in the journal Pediatrics followed 2 groups of mothers from the early weeks of their babies' lives. One group was encouraged to increase physical contact with their babies, carrying them more, picking them up promptly when they cried, maintaining more skin-to-skin time. The other group followed standard practices. At 6 weeks, the babies who had received more physical contact cried significantly less than the comparison group. Not more, less. The effect was not small. The increased contact group showed a 43% reduction in crying across the day compared to the standard group. A 43% reduction. From doing the thing that generations of parents were told would make crying worse. Subsequent research has extended these findings in multiple directions. Studies tracking children from infancy into early childhood have found that babies who were responded to consistently in the first year showed lower levels of anxiety, better emotional regulation, and fewer behavior problems at age 2 and 3 compared to babies who experienced less responsive caregiving. The effect runs in exactly the opposite direction from what the spoiling theory predicts. More responsiveness in infancy does not produce more demanding, more dysregulated children. It produces children who have learned at the level of their nervous system that the world is manageable, and who therefore do not need to scream at it quite so hard. Now here is the layer that most discussions of this topic leave out. Because the research on responsive caregiving is not just about crying frequency, it is about what is happening in the brain while the crying is occurring and while the response is being received. When a baby is in distress and no response comes, the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which governs the stress response, remains activated. Cortisol continues to circulate. And cortisol, in the developing brain, is not a neutral presence. Elevated cortisol during critical periods of brain development affects the structure and function of the hippocampus, which is involved in memory and learning. It affects the amygdala, which governs threat detection and emotional reactivity. It affects the prefrontal cortex, whose development is directly relevant to the very self-regulation that the spoiling theory assumes babies should be learning. The stress of unresolved distress in infancy is not character building. It is neurologically costly, and the cost is paid not just in the moment, but in the architecture of the brain that is being built while the distress is ongoing. So why has the spoiling theory persisted for so long? Partly because it feels intuitive, reward a behavior and you get more of it, withhold the reward, and the behavior extinguishes. Partly because it aligns with cultural values around independence and self-sufficiency that run deep in certain parenting traditions. And partly because the effects of responsive versus non-responsive caregiving are not immediately visible in the way that makes them easy to attribute. A baby who cries for 20 minutes before being picked up does not show obvious signs of neurological impact in the moment. The cortisol spike is invisible. The calibration of the stress response system happens silently across hundreds of interactions over months. The effects show up later, in temperament and emotional regulation, in the ease or difficulty with which the child handles frustration, transitions, separations. By the time those effects are visible, the connection to the early caregiving patterns is not obvious, and so the myth persists. But the data is there, and it has been there for decades, and it points clearly at something that parents who followed their instincts already knew. Holding your baby is not weakness, it is not indulgence, it is not making a rod for your own back. It is the most direct, most effective, most neurologically grounded intervention available for building a stress response system that works well. A nervous system that has learned from the earliest experiences available to it that distress is manageable and that the world can be trusted to respond. The parents who held their babies the most did not raise spoiled children. They raised children whose nervous systems had been given the best possible foundation for handling a world that will not always hold them. There will come a time, soon enough, and it always comes sooner than anyone expects, when your child will be old enough to begin learning how to manage distress independently. To sit with discomfort, to wait, to try and fail and try again, that capacity is coming. It is built on exactly the foundation that responsive early caregiving provides. You cannot spoil an infant, you can only build them, or not. And every time you picked them up, every time you went to them in the night, every time you held them longer than you thought you probably should, you were building, brick by brick, interaction by interaction, one answered cry at a time. You are building a nervous system that knows the world is safe, and that is the most important thing you will ever build. If this finally settled something you have been wondering about, subscribe and leave a comment below. I want to know, did someone tell you that you were holding your baby too much? Because every parent who heard that deserves to know what the science says, and now you do.